Hey guys, welcome to another episode of ACC Audible. Ken and Ian are here, and we're going to do a little bit of season recap now that we've seen the final games of the season. But obviously we're between this awkward coaching transition, bowl game starting time, and so there's a ton of topics to talk about. We're definitely going to get into a little bit of the UNC stuff, Louisville stuff with their new coaching staffs. We're also going to talk about the playoffs and the playoff rankings, and then in a future podcast, we're actually going to review bowl games, and Ken and I are going to pick those bowl games and give our analysis, because there's definitely some good matchups, including a Dave Doran, Jimbo Fisher rematchup. So make sure to look out for that in the next week, guys, as well. But this week we're going to keep it to just the playoff bowl games, and also just kind of this crazy coaching stuff that's going on. Just one quick note, a couple of podcasts ago we talked about Kelly Bryant and possible transfer spots, and Ken and I said that Missouri was probably a really good spot for him, taking over for Locke there, and that's actually where he ended up going. We were unsure if it would be there or UNC, and we kind of edged towards Mizzou, and that's where he ended up going. So congratulations to Kelly Bryant. It's going to be interesting to see how he does in that system, and also facing off against the SEC. Definitely a tough schedule for him, so just wanted to add that program note in. And I'd like to bring in my buddy Ken before we start talking about some of this playoff mumbo-jumbo. Ken, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Kelly Bryant, good for him. It's going to be some big shoes to fill for Drew Lock, who will probably have a great career in the NFL. But I'm pretty excited for Mizzou actually next year. They've got some key guys coming back. A lot of the returning starters on offense and on defense, I believe, and they could be a contender next year in the SEC. Watch out, maybe a dark horse.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I really like what the coaching staff's doing there with Odom. They've done a fantastic job the last couple of years, and now with an experienced, good quarterback like Kelly Bryant, he could have a great season. It could improve his draft stock, and further, it could be a big challenge there in the SEC, which we've definitely seen improve in the last year. So the SEC can continue to get better and better. Just moving on real quick here to the playoffs. No real surprises in the playoff field. The top three kind of remained the same the past whole bunch of weeks. We see Alabama coming in. They're perfect. They're 13-0. They won the SEC championship game. They were down a couple touchdowns to Georgia. They came back. They won that game. Jalen Hurts actually scored the last two touchdowns after Tua was injured and went to the locker room. Just a note, Ken, to hear your opinion on it, this whole Heisman talk, and the Heisman Trophy is going to be announced tonight. Tua really hurt his Heisman stock last week, in my opinion. I know he was a little injured, but he looked awful in that game against Georgia, the best defense he's faced. Where Kyler Murray, on the other hand, looked great in his game against Texas. Of course, those two teams are going to play each other, which is going to be fantastic to see. As Oklahoma, with their one loss against Texas, but they avenged that loss in the championship game, they're coming in at number 4. Kind of crazy to think that there's one loss between all 4 of the playoff teams. We see number 2, Clemson, also went 13-0. They beat up on Pittsburgh in the ACC championship game. And then Notre Dame at 12-0 did not play, obviously, in a championship game. I've heard a lot of people, especially in Big Ten country, very, very frustrated about that, saying that Notre Dame shouldn't even be able to make the playoff since they don't have a championship game. And that leads me to my first thought. Ken, what do you think of this playoff field? But mainly, what do you think about two conferences being left out for the second straight year? The Big Ten was left out this year, and we also see the Pac-12 was left out this year. That's the second year in a row we've seen two conferences left out of this thing.
I think I sent you a text when they released the playoff standings, the final playoff standings, and it was some text, I forget the exact date, but it was like, this will be like 4 years in a row that the Big Ten won't score any points in the playoff. And because they were in the playoff that one year, but they got shut out 31-0 by Clemson. And I just love that stat. I think it's great. Big Ten fans out there, I'm sorry, it sucks, doesn't it? But actually, I don't feel that sorry. But and we will address the Notre Dame issue in the off season. I think we're going to actually devote an entire podcast just to the fairness of them being an independent, whether or not they should, join a conference, all that good stuff. But for purposes right now, we won't get into that. My main thoughts overall on the top 4, I think the committee got it right. I think that this was the option that they really had to make, the choice they had to make, just to kind of show some consistency. This is still a relatively new thing. I believe it's the 5th or 6th year that it's been in place. And it's not a perfect system by any means. I saw someone tweet out that it's not necessarily fair. That it's not even fair to some certain teams just because it seems like more of an invitational than a playoff. And obviously that was from a UCF fan who basically was saying, okay, we've gone 24-0 the last 2 seasons and haven't even come close to even having a shot to make the playoffs. How fair is that? That's not trying to get the best teams in. That's just keeping certain teams out. There's arguments on both sides. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but I do think we're eventually going to see some sort of its expansion. That'll also be another topic that we address in the offseason. But I think the main issue here, there were a couple things, right? People were debating, no one debated that Alabama should be in. What a great game in the SEC championship game to come back against Georgia. So no one debates that. Obviously, Alabama's in. Obviously, Clemson took care of business against a much weaker opponent in Pitt. They should be in. No one debates that, right? So, and I think for the most part, I would say, 75-80% of the country would agree that Notre Dame should have been in. I think there was some debate whether they should have been in at 3 or 4 for what I'm about to talk about. But I think most people thought, okay, they're perfect. They've traveled all over the country. They should be in. And, then you had guys like Kirk Herbstreit, who I don't know if you heard this. We didn't talk about this, but, he was saying that Georgia should actually be in at number 3 and Notre Dame should be at 4. And I was like, wow, that's a bold statement. And he was talking about how he doesn't get caught up in, best resume, but best 4 teams, and I can kind of understand where he's coming from. I'm not saying I agree by any means. Like I said, I think they got the 4 correct teams in. I think that Oklahoma definitely should have been in the playoff. But I think Herbstreit has touched on a point that will cause expansion later on, right? Like, I think that he's talking about kind of what you and I talked about last podcast, where, the 4 best teams may not be the 4 most deserving teams, right? Like, a lot of people probably agree that Georgia may very well be one of the 4 best teams in the country, especially after that game against Alabama in the SEC championship game. But then, you can't reward a loss, right? You can't reward a team for losing. They lost. They had a chance to beat. This is really their second chance to beat Alabama. They haven't done it. You're going to give them a third chance to do it and probably not happen. I just don't see how they could have put Georgia in over Oklahoma, who won their championship game against Texas, avenged their only loss of the season. I just don't see how you could put Georgia in. I'd actually be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. Did you hear Kirk say that on the broadcast?
I did, yes. I absolutely heard Herbstreit say that. The point is this. Either they're going to have to extend the playoff out to 8 teams, or they're going to have to make super conferences. So 4 super conferences instead of the Power 5. Those are really the 2 options. But Ken, here's how I look at it. It's impossible to know which teams are better than other teams unless they play each other. And even at that point, there's still argument over, well, they had a bad game or the system matchup against their system isn't good. There's always arguments. I think it's great to put in different conferences and teams that haven't played each other just because, for example, Oklahoma was the best team in the Big 12. So now if Alabama beats them, we can say, okay, fair enough, transitive property, Alabama would have beaten the Big 12, right? We can assume that. We can make that up. Whereas if we just left the Big 12 out, now there's a question mark all offseason of, was the Big 12 better than the SEC? Because we didn't see games this year that would have demonstrated that at all. We have zero idea if the SEC really is good. Is Alabama's 13-0 really that good? I mean, their non-conference schedule was fairly weak because of, Louisville being awful and they played the Citadel, stuff like that. And then their in-conference schedule was hit and miss. They still destroyed all these teams. And so if you win in 13 straight games, that's incredible. No question. But do we really know how good they are? We don't. And maybe the best glimpse we had of that was last week against a Georgia team who is also excellent, only the 1 loss. Georgia, the question is this. If Georgia would have barely lost that game, but they would have won their game earlier in the season to, I believe it was LSU they lost to, right?
Yes, correct.
If they would have actually won against LSU and then lost to Alabama by 7, they would have made the playoff, no question, at number 3 in my mind. The committee would have put them in. But the fact that they already had that loss, you can't put them in. I disagree with Herbstreit there, but I just like seeing 4 teams that have not played each other from different conferences make it in, because it gives all those conferences a chance, a shot. Hey, if Oklahoma beats Alabama, it goes to show, you know what? Maybe Alabama wasn't as good as we thought, or maybe that defense isn't as good as we thought, that type of thing. Also, just a note here on these teams before we kind of talk about the games, and you kind of, heck, let's just pick them a little bit. But my real thing here I think is awesome. Teams ranked number 1, 2, and 3 made voluntary quarterback changes during the season. That's absolutely crazy to me. They weren't injury calls or anything, but teams number 1, 2, and 3 voluntarily changed their quarterbacks from the beginning of the season. We see that Jalen Hurts, Tua took over for Jalen Hurts. We see at number 2, Trevor Lawrence came in for Kelly Bryant, who we just talked about. And then further, number 3, we see that Winbush was out, replaced by Ian Book. So just absolutely crazy. I don't think I have ever seen that before. And then especially teams 1 and 2, they both have Heisman-type guys, which makes sense because they're ranked highly. But as such young guys, Trevor Lawrence, he'll be in the Heisman talk in the next couple of years, you assume. But the way Etienne's been running the ball, maybe not even because they won't have to pass it as much. But just kind of crazy the quality of quarterback play we've seen. And then Kyler Murray, Heisman guy right there, number 4, absolutely nuts. The quality of play we're seeing out of guys who didn't exist last year. I mean, Kyler Murray didn't play much last year. He did a little bit, but none of these guys played last year. Now they're just amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, man. Also, I really liked your point about, not seeing teams having played before or conferences having played before. It's a great measuring stick of how good the conferences actually are. That's what I love about bowl season. But to your point about the first 3 teams, with the quarterback changes, that's so crazy. I mean, we talked about earlier in the year how this was the year of what seemed like, quarterback juggling and who's going to start for your team. There were so many teams that were doing the 2 quarterback thing or making decisions like Clemson did or like Notre Dame did. And I think it's 2 things, right? I think that in one sense, some of these elite teams, they are able to recruit at such a high level that they have options when it comes to the quarterback position. It used to be that not a lot of teams had, multiple good quarterbacks that could start at an FBS level. But now you're seeing that, especially the elite teams, they have 2, 3 guys even that could start anywhere else in the country. I mean, Alabama has 3 5-star quarterbacks on their roster right now. And then also the level that these high school kids are coming out as. I mean, it's incredible, right? You look at Trevor Lawrence. True freshman, was in high school last year, and now he has a chance to play in the national semifinal, maybe even the national championship game. I mean, that's insanity to me. I think that's crazy. I think it's a great thing for the sport. I think you're only going to see things go higher from here. I mean, guys like Justin Fields, guys like Sam Howell coming into the ACC next year. I mean, these guys are coming in so prepared. And I think also, too, you and I have talked a little bit about this, the simplification of offenses as a whole in football in general, not just college, but in the pros a little bit as well. The simplification of reads, it makes it a little easier to come in and start right away, as opposed to, 15, 20 years ago when the systems were a little bit more complicated, a little bit more at the line of scrimmage. So I think that's what you're starting to see a little bit. Guys are more prepared and the systems are a little bit easier to handle.
And for sure, sometimes the rule changes we've seen that have benefited the offenses have no doubt helped that. The offensive simplicity plus the rule changes together, it makes it so much harder to play defense. You don't have to have as complicated of an offense to disguise things or scheme things and misdirection plays. It's just not as necessary as it used to be. And a lot of the strategy now is a simple offense that tires out the other team or bludgeons the other team until they finally submit type of thing. Right. But definitely really interesting to see and also totally random, but I'm just thinking about a lot of these guys that are coming out of high school ready to play in college, and it makes me think most of them are Southern guys. And I think I saw a stat the other day, something like 53% of NFL players come from 6 states.
Wow.
And the other, absolutely crazy. And then 44 states make up the other, 47% or so. I'm not exactly sure on the numbers, but that was a rough estimate. I was blown away. But it makes a lot of sense when you look at a lot of these guys who are going out into the SEC, ACC, different players like that, and seeing how prepared they are coming out of high school. They're already 2 years ahead of their contemporaries. And if you're ahead of guys, then you're going to make the NFL, and they won't, because when they're paying you millions of dollars, they don't have time to develop you as much as they'd like to. But just moving on to some thoughts here real quick about the playoff. I'm not going to pick any games. We'll save that for our next podcast where we talk about the rest of the bowls. But I'm really fascinated by both these games, man. We see Oklahoma, whose defense actually did step up last week against Texas, but their offense is incredible with Kyler Murray. And then, of course, we see Alabama and just how great they've played all season, offense and defensive-wise, but especially offensively, which is crazy. That's going to be an awesome matchup. But mainly, Clemson-Notre Dame is one that fascinates me because they have 4 common opponents this year. They all played Syracuse, Wake Forest, Florida State, and Pittsburgh. Obviously, they beat all of them. But the margin of victories is kind of nuts to me. Clemson only beat Syracuse by 4. That, of course, was a game where Trevor Lawrence left at halftime with an injury, so the stats are a little bit different. But then Clemson beat Wake Forest by 60, Florida State by 49, Pittsburgh by 32. You flip the script, Notre Dame, they only beat Pittsburgh by 5 points. They did not look good in that game at all. But they beat Syracuse by 33, Wake Forest by 29, Florida State by 29. So both of them had one struggle game, and the rest were blowouts. So if you really just look at the matchups, it's hard to tell which team is better. They both had a slip-up game, but they continued to win. What do you see out of this game, man? I mean, we're going to see, obviously, Ian Book and Trevor Lawrence go against each other. And by the way, Book started all 4 of those games I mentioned, except the Florida State game. He did not play in that one. Winbush did. But what are you going to see out of this matchup? What are you looking forward to most out of the Cotton Bowl?
Yeah, the Cotton Bowl, man. You know, it's interesting. I think that I came away from last weekend overall having a lesser view of Clemson and of Alabama. And let me tell you why. For so long of the season, I've really kind of put them both on a pedestal, like I think a lot of people have. They've been so dominant, especially Alabama the last 10 years, Clemson the last 4. And they've really just had no challenges along the way except for themselves when they play each other. And I think that, sometimes we fall into that false sense of security, as fans of college football. And, to me, yes, Clemson did take care of business against Pitt. The final score was very lopsided. But I do think that there are vulnerabilities there. I think a lot of people have documented the back end of that defense is not as good as in years past, and obviously, you're going to be the weakness of your defense when the defensive line is all going to play in the NFL next year. That's just naturally going to be the case. But I think in general, though, that secondary is vulnerable more so than previous secondaries that Clemson's had, over the past 3 seasons. It'll be interesting to me. I think that the matchup to watch, besides the trenches, we all know it's won and lost, defensive line, offensive line. So besides that matchup, obviously, I think that it's going to be really fascinating to see if Ian Book can take care of the ball down the field, if he can take advantage of that Clemson secondary, take some shots deep early, stretch them out a little bit, put them back on their heels a little bit. Obviously, that will depend on if he has time. So I look for Brian Kelly to be a little creative about how he gets Book, changing his throwing points, rolling him out of the pocket, do a little sprint out action, some quick screen game to kind of get that defensive line settled down for Clemson, and then take some shots on that secondary that I've just talked about just being a little weaker than in years past. And then, what's going to be interesting, Trevor Lawrence, we've talked about him all season. We're all big fans of this kid. He looks like a woman, but it's okay. A really ugly woman, but
Wow.
I think, hey, listen, I mean, he's a great football player. But I do think it's going to be interesting, the pressure that one has to feel, as a true freshman. This is his first, national semifinal game. It's his first experience like that. I wonder how they treat him in that game. Do they lean on ETN in the running game early on in that game? Because if Notre Dame's going to stack the box, which I expect them to do, I expect Notre Dame to put 8 guys in the box and force Trevor Lawrence to beat them on the outside. And so you wonder, does Dabo say, hey, listen, we're going to lean on ETN. We know we can run the ball, because that's what happened this season, right? Like when Trevor Lawrence struggled, when he went out against Syracuse in that game, they leaned on that running game, and the running game responded. They were able to run the ball at will, even when teams knew they were going to do it. So it's going to be interesting if they can do the same thing to Notre Dame, who would be the best defense probably that they faced all season. So I think it's going to be a really good game. I'm going with Clemson in this game, but I don't know, maybe my official pick, when we do the bowl games next podcast, will have changed since then. Right now, I'm leaning towards Clemson.
Yeah, I definitely think Clemson's the best team here, and I'm leaning towards them as well. And I can't wait till we do our actual picks. We've got till the 28th of this month, I guess. But when you really look at it, the game that scared me in particular was the South Carolina game. They come out of the Boston College game in which they completely shut out Boston College's offense. Their only touchdown was a punt return or a kickoff return, I believe a punt. But then they turn around the next week, and South Carolina kept pace with them for a while. I know they ended up winning, 56-28 or whatever it was, but they gave up 4 touchdowns where their secondary looked like they didn't even exist. Routes across the middle where the receiver just caught it and like one missed tackle, boom, touchdown. Like the safety wasn't even there or ready to tackle. Assignments, coverages, it just did not look good. And I was shocked because the game, Clemson go up 7-0, then 7-7. Then Clemson went up 21-7, and then all of a sudden South Carolina crawls back. I was really, really surprised. And I think they actually played better against Pittsburgh, and I know Pickett isn't the type of guy, Pittsburgh's quarterback, to throw the ball around, and they shut down Pittsburgh's running game pretty well. But still, if you have a cannon for an arm, which, Ian Book's a pretty decent quarterback, and Winbush has a pretty decent candidate for an arm as well. We saw that against Michigan the first quarter this season. I'm a little bit concerned for Clemson's secondary. I still think they're the better football team. Their defensive line is very good. But you're right. If they're going to stack the box and keep ETN contained, which I think is the key to beating them, Trevor Lawrence is going to have to be sharp. And it's a lot easier for a quarterback to have an off night than a running back. And so if they tee up on ETN and they make Lawrence throw it, maybe those lights will be too bright. A playoff game, who knows? But it'll definitely be interesting to see. Moving on through our standings just for the ACC this year. Congratulations to Clemson, by the way, on winning the ACC. A perfect 8-0 mark. They scored 378 points this year, but only allowed 93 all season. Very impressive. 13-0 overall in conference. I'm sorry, those are the numbers in their 8 conference games. Very impressive to allow less than 100 points in their 8 conference games. Just absolutely crazy. 13-0 overall, perfect 7-0 home record. But we also see Syracuse finish second in that division, a perfect 6-0 home record. Congratulations to Syracuse going 9-3. That's awesome. NC State also went 9-3, so the 3 best teams coming out of the Atlantic this year, as we talked about early in the season. Boston College stumbled down the stretch. They finished 7-5, and their offensive coordinator just left to become the head coach at Bowling Green, actually, which is interesting. Florida State, for the first time in ever since the 70s, is not bowl eligible. They went 5-7 this season. Willie Taggart's trying to get things straightened out there. He has a couple of coaching staff changes we're about to talk about, but definitely hoping to get the ship righted there. Wake Forest finished 6-6, which shocked Ken and I greatly because we did not pick them, as we talked about last time, to beat Duke or to finish the season like they did. They look so bad, and they came back 6-6. Louisville went a perfect 0 wins and 8 losses in conference this year. 2 wins overall, and as we talked about before, they went 7-7 into halftime against an FCS school this year, and then they barely beat, I think it was Western Kentucky to get their other win, so not very good. You look at the Coastal, a bit of a struggle. 4 teams ended up getting 7 wins. Pittsburgh, Georgia Tech, UVA, Miami, all 7 wins and 5 losses. Pittsburgh added an extra loss last week at the championship game, which means that if they lose their bowl game to Stanford, they could go 7-7. And I don't remember seeing a team go 7-7 in college football like ever. So that would be pretty fascinating because not many people play 14 games and go 500. We saw Virginia Tech squeak out a win last week to go 6-6 and become bowl eligible for the 26th or 27th straight year. Duke ended up 7-5, definitely slid towards the end of the season, and UNC with their new coaching staff 2-9. So kind of crazy to think the only teams in the entire ACC with a losing record this year: UNC, Louisville, and Florida State. So 11 of the 14 teams had a winning record. Pretty good, but a lot of them only 7 wins. So just a quick recap on the conference there. Before we jump into some other topics, and we just mentioned Louisville with the perfect 0-8 record, 2-10 overall. They paid $14 million to their head coach to be fired, and we swore that was because they had a guy lined up, a guy that they loved to come in for that job, Jeff Brom. We all thought the deal was signed, and it wasn't. He's not going to be their head coach. He's staying at Purdue. It kind of shocked everybody, to be completely honest. But we actually see that Scott Satterfield from Appalachian State, who's been there quite a while in Boone, North Carolina, he's actually going to move over and be Louisville's next head coach. Ken, what are your thoughts on Satterfield taking over that job?
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Louisville, and we at the beginning of the year when they got pounded by Alabama. We're like, everyone loses to Alabama first game of the season. They'll be okay. They'll right the ship. And man, were we wrong. That ship never got righted, did it? But
well, as soon as we realized who their defensive coordinator was, Brian Van
true.
Gorder, we realized as soon as we saw that their season was over. So we'll give ourselves a little bit of credit.
Yeah, by the way, our buddy Van Gorder is now looking for a job. Be shocked if anyone picks him up. But
well, I heard Walmart needs some help loading boxes into people's cars at Christmas time. So maybe we should suggest that to him.
I think that might be a little too complicated for old Van Gorder. But so yeah, they went after Jeff Brom, and rightfully so. He was the local guy, the guy that everyone seemed to want. And basically, he turned him down, and for good reason. You and I both said, why would you leave Purdue to go to Louisville? I mean, we knew he had the ties there, but overall, he's got a great thing going at Purdue. They had a good season back into the season, so he decides to stay there. And they, honestly, though, I think they really hit a home run with their hire. They go with Scott Satterfield. He has helped Appalachian State navigate the waters from transitioning from an FCS team to an FBS team. He was 40-11 with back-to-back Sun Belt championships as the head coach there. And, really what's interesting is he was actually an Appalachian State guy. I mean, he played quarterback there. He coached the majority of his coaching career there as an assistant, had a couple stints elsewhere until he became the head coach, I believe it was 2 or 3 seasons ago. But so he's been an Appalachian State guy, but I think, just the ability to coach in a Power 5 conference at a place like Louisville was enough to kind of lure him away. He is bringing in his defensive coordinator from Appalachian State, Brian Brown. That will help make that transition a little easier, I think. And it's going to be really interesting. I mean, that Louisville is a place where they have really kind of turned that culture a little more towards the football program in the last 10 years. For so long it's been a basketball school, and of course they have a great basketball acumen. They've had great tradition there. But, in the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, they've really turned more to their football program, putting in more money. Boosters are being more supportive, and I do think that this is a great hire, honestly. Satterfield's a great young coach. I think that he's a great offensive mind. I think that they're going to be explosive again on offense, and I think that he does have talent to work with there. Much like Willie Taggart, who we're going to talk about in a second, I think that Louisville just got too used to losing. I think that, like Florida State, they were mentally weak, and at the first sign of adversity, they folded. And I think that his first real task at Louisville is going to be kind of changing that culture, changing that mentality from losing into winning. First, before you can win games, you have to believe that you can win those games, right? And so I think that's his first major task as head coach, is changing that mentality that kind of just was disastrous at the end for Petrino. So I think that's a great hire, and I think, honestly, it's one of the better hires so far that we've seen. I might even like it a little more than the Mac Brown hire at UNC, honestly.
Yeah, some interesting hires, very different ends of the spectrum there. But it's good for Louisville to see that this is going on. You mentioned how they've shifted in the last 10 to 5 years from full basketball to football. And, I mean, the truth is when you have that many scandals going on with basketball, it's kind of hard to support it, right? So that's probably why their donors are trying. Because, their donors used to give money directly to the basketball players. But now that the NCAA has confirmed that they cannot do that, they're like, well, I guess I should give the money to the football team. But I'm guessing they're not giving money to the football players, or else they'd be better. I don't know. But anyway, just jumping from that, I totally agree that it's going to be an interesting transition, bringing this defensive coordinator there. Literally a warm body would be better at coordinating defenses than Brian Van Gorder, so I assume their defense will take a step in the right direction. They do have some talent, man. Cunningham at quarterback, Puma pass. They had some flashes of brilliance, but the blocking was so awful, they didn't really have a shot to even set their feet half the time. But a lot of youth on that team, and that really killed Petrino. And in a lot of ways, it's shocking Petrino was fired because, he had 3 winning seasons in a row. He, tied for the Atlantic lead 2 years ago, with Clemson. It's really kind of amazing if you think about it that he was fired after one bad season, but it's the way it is now. What have you done for me lately? And speaking of, Paul Johnson lately has not been as good as he was before. I believe this was his 11th season at Georgia Tech this year. He is going to a bowl game, and he will coach in the Quick Lane Bowl. He compiled a record of 82 wins, 59 losses in his 11 seasons, including, actually, I don't know if you know this, Ken, 2 years ago when they beat Georgia, That was the last time Georgia's lost at home. So it just shows how good Georgia is. But anyway, he's beaten a lot of good teams. Jeff Collins is coming in there. He's from Temple. He's a 15-win, 10-loss record there. Previous defensive coordinator at Florida and Mississippi State. It's just going to be an interesting transition there as well. I'm surprised that they hired him. A lot of talk about Ken Wisenhunt and some other guys possibly going there. But the truth is, Jeff Collins, this is his dream job. And he has said that before. He's from Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. He's been on the GT staff in 1999 through 2001, and then also in 2006. He was a recruiting coordinator there before. He's from Conyers, Georgia. He seems like he just loves Georgia Tech football, and he's already given a shot at Georgia, basically saying, oh, well, in our region we recruit at, we're the only school that has a degree worth getting. So I thought that was pretty cool. Already taking shots at his rival, and he said he's going to refuse to use red pens anymore, and he's going to throw them all out. So what do you think of this Jeff Collins hire, man? It's a guy's name who, honestly, I'm not super familiar with.
Yeah, it's funny. You're reading that in the stat line, and I have the exact same things on my note sheet right here. But yeah, basically, when Paul Johnson retired, you and I were both kind of shocked. And first of all, kudos to him, man. No one thought he was going to be successful when he came from was it the Naval Academy? Was that where he came from when he came over? I'm pretty sure it was Naval Academy. And no one thought he was going to be successful when he brought the triple option to the ACC. And you know what? To a large extent, he proved the haters wrong. I would say that, he went to an ACC championship game. He had that great win against Mississippi State. Ironically, I think that Jeff Collins was actually the defensive coordinator for that game against Mississippi State. I'll have to double check that. But anyway, kudos to Paul Johnson. Really great career. Nothing to be ashamed of. And I think it's really great that he's going to coach the bowl game. Jeff Collins is a guy that, he's a defensive guy, right? This is different from Paul Johnson. Paul Johnson obviously was the triple option man. And now they turn more to their defense. He's a guy that this is the exact opposite situation of Louisville. Like, Louisville didn't get their home guy. They didn't get Jeff Brum. Georgia Tech got their home guy. He's from Georgia, like you said. He has recruiting ties, which I think is huge from his time as defensive coordinator at UF and Mississippi State. So he'll be able to go in right away, have these relationships with previous high school coaches, and be able to recruit immediately. And I think, honestly, be able to recruit well. I think that this is now something that, teams in the South in that area need to be put on notice a little bit. Georgia Tech is one of those schools that they're always going to be hindered a little bit in recruiting just by the fact that their degree is so much more strenuous than other schools. I mean, it's so much even harder to just get accepted to Georgia Tech than, say, a Georgia or a Florida State or, a UF or the schools in that area. So they're going to be, held down a little bit by that, but I think that he will do a better job recruiting than Paul Johnson was able to, just purely because, of the system that they run. He is a defensive guy. He runs an aggressive 4-3 style, much like a lot of defensive coordinators, but the first thing that he will be tasked to do is to modernize this offense, bring in a guy that is going to modernize this offense that will appeal to recruits, unlike what Paul Johnson's system did. There was no chance that if you were an offensive guy coming out of high school, he did put guys in the NFL, but it definitely wasn't the normal track of, going into an offense that features your abilities at the next level. So I think that, for Jeff Collins, his first job is to bring in an offensive coordinator that is going to run an attack that fits his defense, but also fits what recruits are looking for a little bit. That will help them in recruiting, and I think really put them on the right track. I look for this turnaround to take some time. It's going to be a culture rebuild, similar to what I was talking about with Louisville, but a culture rebuild in a different way because they're coming from the triple option. I mean, that's such a different sort of offense, and that's, it would be like Army changing to the spread option offense or like a quick tempo offense. Like, that would take a long time, and I think that this turnaround will take a while, but he had Temple going in the right direction, 8-4, 7-5, and so I think he's going to have Georgia Tech going in the right direction. It just may take a little bit of time before we see the effects of it.
Yeah, great career for Paul Johnson. Obviously, a good career at Navy. He won a lot of Commanders and Chiefs trophies there. And then as well, his 11 seasons at Georgia Tech, he won the ACC. He won, New Year's Six equivalents now, Orange Bowl. Awesome. He had certainly a great career. But this is an interesting hire because Collins, he said he's going to install NFL-style systems for offense and defense. So it's going to be interesting to see what he does. I think it's fascinating that they went with a defensive-minded guy. It goes to show the offense probably didn't matter that much to them at Georgia Tech. They weren't offended by the triple option or tired of it, the administration there, I'm saying. Because if they were, they probably would have gone out and hired, a Clemson offensive coordinator or something like that. And then there were some rumors that they might try to hire Army's head coach because he's triple option. But I think it's a solid hire. I wish Paul Johnson luck in his bowl game against Minnesota. Fun fact there, Minnesota just beat Wisconsin for the first time in 14 years in their rivalry games. So they're coming off a pretty good high there. PJ Fleck obviously took Western Michigan 13-0 to a Cotton Bowl loss to Wisconsin a couple of years ago. So good for him getting his team in the right direction, but I certainly hope Paul Johnson and Georgia Tech come away with a big old W there in a couple of weeks. And then also shifting to Mack Brown. Mack Brown was just up in New York City at the College Hall of Fame introductions. He and Frank Beamer were up there for that. But in his spare time in North Carolina, he's been assembling a staff. And just a couple of notes on his staff. Dre Bly, obviously pretty good player back in the day. He's a 2014 College Hall of Fame player, three-time All-American. He's going to be the cornerbacks coach at UNC. That's the position that he was a three-time All-American at, of course. Tim Brewster, hired away from Texas A&M. He was with Mack Brown for 13 seasons at UNC and at Texas. He's going to be the assistant head coach, tight ends coach. I think I saw Tim Cross. He was with Brown at Texas, and he's done a few different things. He's currently the assistant head coach and defensive line coach at Air Force. And then Tommy Thigpen is currently the safeties coach at UNC. They hired him last January. He played for Brown, and he will actually be elevated to the co-defensive coordinator and safeties spot. And that's an area that needs a lot of work because UNC gave up 34.5 points per game last year, 107th out of the 130 teams in college football. Pretty bad. The offense wasn't too much better, 27.4 points per game. That's 77th best in the country. Not very good. And their recruiting class, December 19th starts the early signing period, and they better hurry up. They have only 8 players committed at UNC. They have the 91st best class in the nation, and they're 13th out of 14th in the ACC, according to 247. What do you think about some of these hires? Do you see any others besides these 4 that have been announced? These are just what I have in my notes, but I think overall decent hires. Maybe on the age side, a little bit higher than some people thought. He went with the very familiar faces instead of any up-and-comers.
Yeah, first off, you talked about recruiting and how they need a lot of help there. Ian, let me tell you, man, Tim Brewster, to me, so far, has been the home run hire of this staff. And not so much because of his tight end coaching acumen, but he is an ace recruiter. I mean, when he was here at Florida State with Jimbo, I mean, he was Jimbo's go-to guy. He's basically his recruiting coordinator and served in the same capacity while coaching tight ends at Texas A&M. That is a huge get for Mack Brown and this staff. I guarantee you they will be able to pull some blue-chip recruits just off this Tim Brewster hire. He's a great recruiter, is tireless on the road. He's in a plane all the time, basically. He's a decent tight ends coach, but really, I mean, Jimbo's all over that offense, so he hasn't had to do anything in the last few years. So, and I would assume that whoever they bring in as offensive coordinator will have that same capacity of kind of taking that role. But Brewster really, don't be fooled, Brewster is really there for recruiting. And so I think that's a great hire. I do like the other 3. I like the Dre Bly hire a lot. The other 2 I'm not as familiar with, but you asked about other things that I've heard. We mentioned that maybe Gene Chizik, former UNC defensive coordinator, former Auburn head coach, might be considered for the defensive coordinator position. That does not look to have panned out. It looked like, actually, that Mack Brown was going to hire Greg Robinson, one of his old buddies, who coached with him briefly at Texas, as his new defensive coordinator. You and I both thought that was going to be a horrible hire. I mean, I think I saw, so many UNC fans on Twitter just being like, well, I'm done with UNC if this hire happens. Greg Robinson infamously was known for his time with Rich Rodriguez at Michigan, having 2 of the worst defensive performances in back-to-back seasons at Michigan. But that turned out to also not happen. So they dodged the bullet there with that one. That would have been a really poor hire. And then also, one hire that I thought was going to happen that I thought might be a good hire was Cliff Kingsbury, and it does look like he was a candidate, but actually USC, Southern California, was able to swoop in. Clay Helton makes that hire and hired Cliff Kingsbury as their new offensive coordinator, so the air raid style offense will not be making its way to Chapel Hill for Mac Brown. Another name that I heard also, which is interesting, it seems as if Mac Brown really wants to open things up on the offense because he apparently went pretty hard after Graham Harrell, and if that name sounds familiar, man, he was a former Texas Tech QB, I believe was there when Michael Crabtree was there and won the Biletnikoff Award that year. Also part of that Mike Leach air raid tree, and he was the offensive coordinator at North Texas right now. They thought that there was going to be a job or a deal done between UNC and Harrell, but apparently it looks like UNT was able to keep him in Denton, Texas. So as of right now, the two big positions, we talked about this with Mac Brown, those OC and DC hires were going to make or break his time at UNC. And not to sound bad, but he has pressure immediately. These hires need to be good hires right off the bat. He doesn't have time to take 2 seasons with one guy and find out he's not the right person and then hire another person. He needs to make good hires right now, and so I think that's why you're seeing this process take a little longer. I think he knows how important these hires are, and he knows he has to make a good hire in the long run for the program. So that's what I'm hearing right now about UNC. So far, I like the hires, but I think if you ask me what the best hire is right now, it's that Tim Brewster hire.
Helton was so smart out at USC to make that hire of Kingsbury.
Absolutely.
Because, he was on the hot seat this year, and he's realized with Mike Leach bringing the air raid offense to the Pac-12, hey, this thing works. Obviously, the past couple of years, they haven't been able to win the Apple Cup. Washington State hasn't, because Washington State had a shot, an outside shot at the playoff, though, if they would have won that game and then beaten Utah in the Pac-12 championship game. But still, that offense has been very impressive this year. Helton noticed that for sure. Great job hiring the former Texas Tech head coach. His offensive system is absolutely incredible. Really interesting to see Mac Brown going after 2 different air raid guys. I think it would be really cool to bring the air raid into the ACC. We saw that right as Mac Brown was leaving Texas in his later years there, that's when Mike Leach and the air raid really was blowing up the Big 12. And we see now that's kind of their stamp, right? Their rubber stamp is the air raid style offense. And Lincoln Riley runs it better than anybody right now at Oklahoma, as we've seen. So it'll be interesting to see who he actually does hire there, because his offensive coordinator is going to be the make and break hire of the staff, I think. So it will definitely be, he's more of a defensive guy, obviously more of a CEO type of coach we talked about before, but he'll definitely be able to help the defense. But offensively, an up-and-coming young guy with a lot of potential that could really change that team. Speaking of up-and-coming young guys, Willie Taggart, up-and-coming young coach, very sought after for years, went to Oregon, looked good his first season there, went to Florida State, did not look as good his first season there, with better recruits than he even had at Oregon. Very, very interesting to see what's going to happen with Willie Taggart and his staff, because he's losing guys, and there's a lot of questionable decisions and interviews going on. And mainly what I want to talk about there, man, and you know this one so well, so I'll give you most of it, but Walt Bell, he got to call on offense the last few games of the season. So Taggart gave it up to Walt Bell, I believe, and basically said, hey, you take it. I need to be more in control of the rest of the team and motivate them. And so Walt Bell left to be the UMass head coach, so congratulations to him getting a head coaching job. Obviously, that's awesome. I don't know what UMass exactly saw in him. I guess his past track record's pretty good, but obviously there's reasons why coaches go after, or schools go after certain coaches, so congratulations on him. And then rumors came out of the woodwork that Hugh Freeze was possibly talking to Florida State for that offensive coordinator position, but there's apparently some disagreement there. They wanted to lock Hugh Freeze into a contract, and he wanted to be flexible in case someone gave him a head coaching job again. Obviously, we've seen Hugh Freeze. He was fired from Ole Miss because of the scandals where they found out about he was not in control of his coaches. They gave him proper benefits to players, to recruits. And then also, obviously, the whole cell phone issue where they tracked his calls and found he's making multiple calls to escort services and a bunch of different things. He actually is going to be the next head coach at Liberty University, which is kind of crazy. He was hired by, I think it's Ian McGill, is the athletic director at Liberty. He oversaw the scandal at Baylor, where they essentially, pimped out, people to their recruits for football under Art Briles. But I will have to say that Freeze, he did speak at Convocation at Liberty earlier this year with his wife, and he, talked about his mistakes and how he screwed up in the past and was very apologetic and seemed to have turned his life around. And maybe that has to do part of why they hired him. It seems like he has had some time to reflect on his mistakes, and we all make mistakes. So I don't want to say that his past should overshadow now. Very interesting that he's going to a large Christian university. Hopefully that helps keep him even more upright. But also, speaking of Art Briles and the fact that his athletic director's at Liberty, the rumor is now that Kendal Briles, the son of Art Briles and the current Houston offensive coordinator, might be the next Florida State offensive coordinator. And the even bigger rumor, I guess this isn't too big of a rumor, is that Taggart supposedly is going to give more control to the offensive coordinator from fall camp, from day one, instead of trying to be in control like this season. So this could be a huge opportunity for whoever has that position, because the talent and skill level at Florida State is pretty dang good. So I'm wondering what's going to happen with this Kendal Briles stuff. What do you think, Ken?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. I think when you talk about Walt Bell leaving, a lot of Florida State fans kind of raised an eyebrow a little bit, right? Because, for the most part, no one was happy with the offensive output, but no one really blamed Walt Bell because, for the most part, majority, 2/3 of the season, it was Willie calling the plays. Things weren't effective, and they didn't get much better with Walt calling the plays, although I did think that the play calling was a little more diverse, a little better when he took over. But then there was some debate about, well, which games did he actually call plays in, which halves of games did he call plays in, and actually there were rumors around here that he had interviewed for the LSU offensive coordinating position during the UF game week here at Florida State. So that rubbed people a lot the wrong way. The talk on the street around here in Tallahassee is that basically, not that him and Taggart just didn't like each other, but they didn't see eye to eye philosophically, in their preparation for games or the way they called plays or the playbook itself. So I think that there was a mutual understanding that Walt Bell needed to find a new position. He was looking for a way out, and I think that Willie is not going to lose any sleep knowing that he's not on the staff anymore. That's not to say that they didn't necessarily get along as people, but they just didn't see eye to eye as coaches. So that I am happy for Walt Bell. I think he is going to be a very successful coach. Maybe not a head coach at UMass, but he will have a good career in coaching college football. And with the Hugh Freeze stuff, man, I can confirm that Hugh Freeze was here on campus interviewing with Willie Taggart. Now, I don't know if it was necessarily an interview per se. It could have been just talking about offensive philosophies. I want to guess, though, that he probably did offer him some sort of job in that capacity. But like you said, it was rumored that he wanted more of a short-term deal because obviously his main end game was head coaching. And you saw that he took a job at Liberty, which is, it's a Christian school, so I maybe understand from a personal standpoint of taking that job. But from a coaching standpoint, it's a pretty small school. So it just shows that he was really looking to become a head coach again. So congratulations to him. I think that, when this search started, I think a lot of fans, when they heard Hugh Freeze's name, were kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. He's got a lot of baggage. But then when Kendal Briles' name surfaced, I think a lot of people were saying, well, you know what? The baggage for Hugh Freeze, I'll take that baggage over the baggage that Kendal Briles brings with him. And listen, we the stuff that went down at Baylor, the multiple cases of rape, and basically a school cover-up. I mean, it's really heinous. It's not good stuff. And I think that the consensus overall right now for most Florida State fans, myself included, is we want no part of the Briles family. I mean, that would just be at least my personal view. I would not be a fan of Kendal Briles coming in any capacity to the Florida State program. But that is the rumor that he is the leading candidate. It's also rumored that he is the leading candidate for the Tennessee offensive coordinator position. The main hang-up right now for both schools seems to be that Briles wants to bring in his offensive line coach, Clement, and help run the offense with him. And both schools, Tennessee and Florida State, like their current offensive line coaches. And so that seems to be part of the issue that's kind of hanging up negotiations with both schools right now. So it's going to be interesting to see. Other names that I've heard connected to the OC vacancy here at Florida State, Jeff Scott, that's kind of a long shot. He's the co-offensive coordinator with Tony Elliott at Clemson. His dad was a big part of the Bowden dynasty here at Florida State, so he has ties to Tallahassee. Also, Larry Fedora, the fired head coach, previous head coach of UNC, obviously was a great offensive mind at Oklahoma State, Southern Miss. And so he's also apparently on the list, as well as T. Martin, although I believe T. Martin is being brought in possibly to fill a wide receiver coaching vacancy, which might eventually happen. So he is the previously OC at USC before Cliff Kingsbury got hired there. So all that to say, man, that, I'm not a huge fan of Kendal Briles. I like his offense, but I'm not a huge fan of him as a person. I don't know the involvement that he had in that Baylor scandal, but I think that a lot of fans here would just be really apprehensive about a Briles family member coming to coach here at Florida State.
Yeah, so offense at Florida State this year is not very good. 115th out of 130th in the country. Definitely need to improve. I find it fascinating what you said about how Briles wants to bring his offensive line coach in, and the two other schools don't want to. I find that fascinating because if you really want a guy, you can make concessions. And so this would be a perfect time for our buddy Mac Brown to just jump in, steal Briles and his offensive line coach, because last time I checked, he doesn't have a coach for either of those positions. So, hey, you never know. It'll be an interesting next couple of weeks. Just one note on the Hugh Freeze thing I think is hilarious, and this will maybe not make the podcast PG. But he said in his press conference at Liberty when he was introduced, he said, "The Son of God, Jesus Christ, he's the only one I've ever met who can handle my junk. If you know somebody else that can do that, I'd love to meet him." And you're laughing perfectly because that's what Twitter blew up with was, I'm sure you've met a few others who can handle your junk. So anyway, on that note, Ken and I have had a great time talking with y'all tonight. Man, we're going to have so much fun talking about the bowl games next time. A lot of great bowl games coming up. For the regular season, I ended up winning our picks, so just want to rub that in a little bit. But we agreed we'd include the bowl games, and so that could change a lot. Well, I hope you guys have a great evening. For my buddy Ken, this is Ian. Let's go ACC.